The Central African nation of Chad has suspended visas for US citizens. Chad's president, Mohamed Idris Deby, made the move public. In a sharp Facebook post, he said Chad would no longer issue visas to Americans. It wasn't out of anger, but the country's president said it was about pride.
Africa is rising, and the winds of change are blowing through the Sahel. In a stunning move of sovereignty and defiance, the Republic of Chad has just hit back at the mighty United States, suspending visas for American citizens after recently demanding US troops pack up and leave. This isn't just about visas. It's about dignity. It's about pride. It's about Africa finally standing tall and saying enough is enough. Let's get into it. On June 3rd, the US government expanded its controversial travel ban to include 12 countries, among them Chad, Iran, Afghanistan, and Haiti. The justification? Alleged inadequate security screening and non-cooperation in deportation processes. But for many African nations, this was seen as yet another arrogant slap in the face, a reminder of how the West continues to treat African countries as children to be scolded, rather than partners to be respected. President Mohamed Idris Deby of Chad wasn't having it. He wasted no time firing back with a bold and symbolic move. Chad will no longer issue visas to American citizens. His words were clear, powerful, and unapologetic. African countries have made significant strides in asserting their independence and taking charge of their own security in recent years. This is shown in their decision to drive Western troops out of their countries. This shift reflects the growing trend of African nations attempting to manage their own security concerns and become self-sufficient. For many years, the United States has maintained a substantial military presence in Africa. However, a recent trend suggests a shift in strategy. There are less and fewer American forces in diverse African countries. In a recent development, as Russia increases its influence in Africa, the government of Chad has vowed to expel US troops. We will learn some of the reasons why Chad wants the United States to withdraw its troops in today's video. We will also discuss several other African nations that have lost interest in the United States. Before we go any further, make sure you add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more developments involving the US, Russia, and African nations. Let's proceed. According to 4 US officials, the government of Chad threatened to terminate a crucial security arrangement in a letter, threatening to give Russia more influence in the region and putting the US at risk of losing its military presence in another African nation. In a letter delivered to the US defense attaché last week, Chadian officials threatened to revoke the Status of Forces Agreement, which establishes rules for US military personnel stationed in Chad. According to the people who shared the letter with CNN, it said that all US personnel would have to leave the French base in N'Djamena, even though the US military isn't specifically told to leave Chad. The US Special Operations Task Force, stationed at the location, which acts as a significant hub for US Special Operations forces in the region, was specifically mentioned in the letter. All US service soldiers in Chad reside in N'Djamena. Therefore, the task force is not the only US military outfit based there. Idris Amin, Chad's Chief of Air Staff, submitted the letter in a unique way for such a significant message, according to intelligence sources. One of Chad's official languages, French, was used to typewrite the message. The letter was not issued through formal diplomatic channels, which is the standard procedure for handling such matters, one of the officials said. The 2 individuals cautioned that the letter might be a negotiating tool the Chadian government would use to negotiate a better price. The number of US forces in Chad is unknown, although according to a US official, there are fewer than 100. However, the United States maintains that its forces have not been asked to leave Chad. The Status of Forces Agreement, which regulates the deployment of American military overseas, is still up for discussion. Keep in mind that this action was taken only a month after the military government of neighboring Niger terminated the contract that permitted U.S. troops to conduct operations there. The departure of over 1,000 American military soldiers from Niger in the upcoming months will disrupt U.S. security and counterterrorism strategy in the volatile Sahel region of Africa. After meeting with Niger's Prime Minister, Ali Amin Zein on Friday, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell agreed to withdraw U.S. armed forces from the country in response to Niger's demands. In the next days, the pullout schedule will be discussed with the Department of Defense. In addition to having a significant impact on the number of U.S. troops in Africa, the massive withdrawal occurs at a time when the U.S. is extremely concerned about the continent's growing relations with Russia and Iran. Keep in mind that the choice was not a complete shock. Niger said last month that it was terminating its military cooperation deal with the United States following a highly contentious series of discussions with a high-level U.S. diplomatic and military team in Niamey, the country's capital. Following Niger's lead, Chad is trying to take advantage of a situation to pressure the U.S. into making additional concessions. Given that American officials have warned that Russian influence is expanding throughout the continent, the decision comes at a critical juncture for U.S. interests in Africa. Following a military coup that overthrew democratically elected President Mohamed Bazoum and installed military authorities, U.S. forces in Niger ceased operations last summer. It's important to keep in mind that although U.S.-African relations vary, not all African nations want the U.S. to go. However, there are a few reasons why some African nations may exhibit this view. The increasing influence of other superpowers, such as China, on Africa could be one factor. China has contributed significantly financially to African countries, primarily through infrastructure projects and trade agreements. As a result, there is a perception that China is more active in Africa than the U.S., which has led to an imbalance in business and diplomatic ties. Another nation that is making progress in Africa is Russia. As part of its strategy in Africa, Russia provides authoritarian governments with political assistance and military sales in exchange for mining rights, financial opportunities, diplomatic support for its foreign policy preferences, and security cooperation. Russia has discovered that support from its African partners has been extremely important in this regard, because Africa supplies a significant majority of the votes voted in the UN General Assembly. In exchange for access to strategically important natural resources, African governments are receiving a regime survival package from Russia's military intelligence agency that includes diplomatic and military assistance. Note that in January, President Mahamat Idris Deby Itno traveled to Moscow to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin stated in a few broadcast remarks that Russia was happy that Deby had brought stability to the nation and was prepared to assist in any manner. These U.S. forces may have left Chad as a result of this conference. The Kremlin discussion covered regional and global concerns, as well as the potential for further developing Russian-Chadian cooperation in a number of areas. More specifically, Russia wants to work with African countries more and be more involved. The Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said Russia was dedicated to expanding its cooperation with African countries and that Chad was one of its potential African partners. Germany is working to increase its connections with groups that can help it deal with the serious instability that Chad is currently experiencing, as combat breaks out between militants from cross-border groups and Chadian government troops. Germany understands the challenge of promoting peace in the Sahel while preserving relations with Russia. Although Germany is eager to forge military ties with Moscow, Chad has not yet contemplated expelling the French soldiers and is unlikely to do so. In recent years, the Russian Federation's foreign policy has placed a greater emphasis on military technical cooperation. In statements posted on its website, the Russian Foreign Ministry has repeatedly emphasized that the primary goals of Russia's military technical cooperation with African countries are the fight against the continent's increasing terrorist population the containment of terrorist threats, and the settlement of local conflicts. Russia has a substantial military presence in African countries. The Wagner Group employs mercenaries in Mali, Libya, and the Central African Republic. Gold and other raw materials are given to the Wagner soldiers in return for their labors. Additionally, the Wagner Group adds to the Kremlin's political clout. Notably, Ibrahim Traoré visited Vladimir Putin as well. In a similar vein, Russia continued its rapprochement with Burkina Faso by reopening its embassy there in December, after closing it in 1992. The presence of the Russian embassy may attract Russian businesses and investors to Burkina Faso. This will lead to more economic opportunity, technology transfer, and job chances. It may also facilitate trade between the two countries, opening up new avenues for growth and expansion of the economy. After all of this, what impact does the US have in Africa? After US forces left African countries, there are questions about how the US will continue to fight terrorism in the area. The United States and African nations have been collaborating to combat extremist terrorist organizations such as ISIL, Boko Haram, and Al-Qaeda. These missions have been thought to need the deployment of US forces. The US military's deployment in Africa has been discussed, which is significant. Many argue that other important aspects of US involvement in Africa, such as development and economic involvement, have been overshadowed by the focus on counterterrorism. The effectiveness of the US military presence in fighting terrorism and its long-term repercussions on regional stability are topics of continuous debate. Whether Chad will remove US troops from their country is still up in the air. The outcome of the diplomatic talks and agreements between the two nations will eventually decide whether or not some Chadian elements want the US forces to leave the country. Chad has the same right as any other sovereign nation to determine whether or not foreign military forces are allowed within its borders. However, it's critical to consider the potential consequences of this decision. The US military's presence in Chad has always been crucial to maintaining regional stability and combating terrorism. As a result, the possible effects on regional security and stability should be thoroughly considered before deciding to remove these forces. The various governments' commitment to shared goals will determine whether or not US forces are removed from Chad. It takes careful balance to prioritize regional security while preserving Chad's autonomy. As the situation progresses, it is uncertain if Chad will choose to retain or remove US military from their country. What do you believe will happen in the upcoming months, in your opinion? This was more than a diplomatic tit-for-tat. It was a statement. A declaration that Africa is no longer content with begging at the tables of former empires. Chad, like other nations in the Sahel, is reclaiming its voice, its future, and its sovereignty. So where is Chad turning now? East, toward new allies like Russia, who are increasingly stepping in to support African countries on their own terms, without the neocolonial strings attached. Just like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger before it, Chad is exploring new partnerships that respect its sovereignty and serve its own interests. This is what Pan-Africanism looks like in the 21st century. It's not just speeches and slogans, it's bold action. Chad's stance is a wake-up call to the rest of the continent. We don't need to ask for respect anymore. We demand it. We don't need to compromise our dignity to fit into someone else's foreign policy agenda. The age of African submission is over. From rejecting visa bans to removing foreign troops and forging new alliances, Chad is stepping into its power, and it might just inspire others to do the same. Do you think more African nations should follow Chad's example? Is this the beginning of a new African independence era? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content on African freedom, Black identity, and global justice. Africa is watching, and this time, we'd write our own story.